Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, guys, I found another account of child essay in Scientology. Shocking, I know. And it's a diary entry 12/27/2008. Scientology Keith Henson and his little personal problem. As Valerie Henson, she has applied to change her name to delete her father's last name, says on www.valhenson.org. My name is Valerie Henson. Keith Henson is my biological father and a serial child molester. He molested at least 4 girls between 1974 and 1981, including at least 2 of his own daughters. His youngest victim was 6 years old. None of the families involved, including ours, pressed charges, believing that a conviction was unlikely. Keith escaped without any punishment. Today, many people regard him as a hero for his opposition to the Church of Scientology. Oh, there you go, you guys. Are you guys putting 2 and 2 together? I can't say what I think on the internet, but all you got to do is put the dots, connect the dots. For years, Keith's daughters have refused to speak on the record about our child molesting father, primarily to protect each other from media attention. We are going on the record now. The child molester Keith Henson, full name Howard Keith Henson, has always been a figure of some minor notoriety. That seems to be a trend. He has been associated with several semi-famous projects or movements such as space colonization, memetics, and storing people's frozen heads. Keith is best known for his long-standing harassment of the Scientologists, a creepy Borg-like cult. What is less well known about Keith Henson is that he molested at least 4 girls between the ages 6 and 12 from 1974 to 1981, including 2 of his own daughters. Our sister Gail finally told our mother that Keith had molested her in 1981. 2 other girls came forward shortly afterwards. Another kept her molestation secret out of fear until several years later. After Gail came forward, Keith confessed that he had molested the girls to his counselors and his wife, Carolyn Meinel. We are honestly not sure how many children Keith molested in total or if he stopped in 1981. I highly doubt he stopped. The results were all too common for cases of sexual abuse. The police were obviously skeptical. You guys need to read between the line on that one. You need to read between the line hard on that one. The law required family counseling before they could move to the next step in the prosecution. The other victims didn't want to testify in court, and Carolyn didn't want to prosecute Keith because she didn't want him killed in prison. Why not? When they found out he was a child molester. In the end, no one pressed charges against Keith. Carolyn divorced Keith, who immediately remarried to R.L. Lucas. Despite being intimately familiar with the circumstances of Keith's divorce, R.L. conceived and gave birth to another daughter. Shortly thereafter, our half-sister Amber, our sister Gail took responsibility for protecting Amber and forced Keith and Arl to allow her to visit and quiz Amber on a regular basis by threatening to prosecute Keith if they denied her access to Amber. The Scientologists. Keith Henson would have faded from the public eye long ago, but for one reason, his campaign against the Church of Scientology. Keith devoted several years of his life to annoying the Scientologists, picketing isolated Scientology compounds, biting the arms of people, and posting prolifically on Usenet. Although Keith's activities had little visible effect, the Scientologists took Keith seriously and began investigating him. The Scientologists quickly found court documents in which Carolyn Meinel explicitly accused Keith Henson of molesting their daughters. They also found people who went on the record saying that Carolyn had divorced Keith for molesting their daughters. Triumphantly, the Scientologists publicized their findings and were universally disbelieved. At present, many people believe that Keith Henson is a heroic freedom fighter, wrongfully persecuted by the Scientologists. Oh, that sounds like Haggis and how many of the other people? I can't blame them. The Scientologists had strong motivation to discredit Keith and might have made up evidence in their desperation. And Keith Henson's 2 wives and 5 daughters have never made any conclusive public statement about his child molesting. Most famously, Keith's first wife, Carolyn Meinel, posted to Usenet an ambiguous message which implied, but did not actually state, that the Scientologists were lying about Keith's child molestation for many years. Keith and Carolyn's daughters refused to go on the record about Keith in any way. Few people noticed our silence, even fewer suspected the true cause of it. Update. Now that this page has gone public, the Scientologists are predictably trying to help by piling on support. We ask that you not allow their actions to taint ours. We detest the Scientologists and have always refused to work with them, the daughters. We, Keith Henson and Carolyn Meinel's daughters, refused to speak on the record about Keith Henson's child molesting habits for many years, for all the usual reasons and then some. Like most RAPE, incest and molestation victims, the shame would fall mostly on us, rather than the criminal, or the punishment. None of us wanted to be the daughter of Keith Henson, child molester, on the national news. Our half-sister Keith and Errol's daughter, Amber Henson, was happily living a normal childhood thanks to Gail's policing of Keith, and would be hurt far more than Keith if we talked. To make matters far, far worse, we had to choose between covering up for our child molesting father and helping the Church of Scientology. Either way, we'd be helping criminals. The Scientologists sent investigators to our houses on a regular basis, trying to convince us to give us anything that they could use against Keith, blackmail. In the end, we kept silent, mostly to protect our half-sister Amber. We all gave the Scientologists the same advice. If you really want to hurt Keith, ignore him. Yeah, and I'm sure the LAPD knew nothing about this either, right? They don't know anything. The Scientologists eventually got Keith Henson convicted for interfering with a religion. Oh, does that sound familiar? Through Keith's deliberate actions, he became a fugitive for many years and could not appear in public. During that time, I became active and even well-known in computer-related professional and social circles. The same circles where Keith was well-known and respected. When people asked me if I was Keith Henson's daughter, I told them that I didn't speak to him and didn't want to talk about him, and left it at that. Keith eventually served his trivial prison sentence and is now out on probation and back in the science fiction, electronic freedom hacker scene, the same group of people who make up a large part of my professional and social network. In November of 2007, I checked into a professional conference and saw my name on the roster right below his. I wanted to vomit or scream or both. I left the conference immediately. I can't simply avoid Keith any longer. After the incident at the conference, I asked my sisters if they would support me going public about Keith. They agreed. And my sister Gail, Keith's first victim that we know of, also decided to go on the record. We no longer care if we benefit the Scientologists. We just hope they don't continue to unwittingly support Keith by attacking him. I am deeply sorry that we covered up for Keith for so long, but I still think it was worth it for allowing Amber to grow up as normally as possible, the wives. Keith Henson's two wives, Carolyn Meinel and Arl Lucas, have supported Keith but have not, to my knowledge, ever directly denied that Keith molested children. Keith's first wife, Carolyn Meinel, divorced Keith in 1982, specifically for molesting her daughters. The first documented testimony from her that I'm aware of is an affidavit filed in support of a later legal action against Keith Henson. I'm not going to read all that. It's in Arizona Superior Court, Pima County. I'm just glancing through it and see if okay, it just goes through medical expenses and stuff like that. Some of Keith's supporters have dismissed this evidence with the facile argument that women often falsely accuse their husbands of child molestation during divorce in order to get more money and assets in the divorce settlement. You know what I want to say to that? I really have a strong feeling that a lot of men, if they were allowed to, they would molest little girls. Absolutely. And I know boys are included in that, but as far as little girls, I really feel a lot of men would if they could get away with it. I do. This argument is incredibly offensive in the general case and completely inapplicable in the specific case. Keith Henson did not then and does not now have any assets to take. He declared bankruptcy during the Scientology court case. Even the house we lived in at the time of the divorce was nearly worthless, as it was undermined by tunnels and not safe to live in. The idea that Carolyn named her daughters as victims of child molestation in public court papers only to extort money from Keith doesn't even pass the laugh test. Keith Henson's ex-wife denies that he was a child molester. What Carolyn actually wrote was carefully crafted to imply that Keith was not a child molester without actually denying it. Oh, that sounds very Scientology. I hope none of you have been reading these. Who is Keith Henson posts assume they are true. What does this sound like, you guys? Remind you of Reddit? As his ex-wife, perhaps I know the real story. Okay, you guys, I'm going to kind of glance through this and see what else. Because she goes into this really... I did not find the story. So there's a bunch of this stuff, I think, posted on a site that was trying to derail and, what is it called? Like, try to make what she was saying not true. There's a lot here. I don't know, for whatever reason, all these ex-wives were trying to say that this guy didn't do it. Okay, so there's a lot of this stuff is a little bit, it's not confusing, but it's just a lot. So I skipped all that, and I'm going to go back to this part. It says, as a child, the whole Keith is a child molester thing seemed very simple to me. Keith is a bad person, and I should stay away from him. But my sisters and I all had to make terrible choices, choices that no one should ever have to make, and we are still making them. To start with, Gail had to choose between getting impregnated by her father and breaking up her parents' marriage at the age of 12. Oh, God. To protect our half-sister Amber, Gail had to threaten to prosecute Keith but not actually do it, because even if Keith was convicted, Gail would be cut off from all contact with Amber for at least a year. Gail then had to periodically live in the same house with Keith for months on end. Something really wrong with women that allow that stuff to go on. In large part, most of our compromises resulted from the fact that siblings have almost no legal rights with regard to each other, while the people who did have legal rights, our parents, were negligent at best and criminal at worst. After my older sisters both ran away from home, driven away by our mother and her new husband, they were cut off from contact from my little sister Virginia and me. Our sisters were afraid for our safety, correctly as it turns out, but couldn't see us in person because our mother threatened to call the police if they came near us. Our sisters had to work with Keith, who did not have some rights to try to contact us, which failed in the end. As a child, I had to choose between risking Carolyn losing custody of me to Keith, a known child molester, and being legally adopted by my stepfather, John Bosma, who had only tried to molest me. See why they're trying to get rid of bang bangs? Can you guys understand why the government is trying to get rid of the bang bangs? Yeah, that's just one reason. Gail invited Amber to our wedding, and Keith and Arl invited themselves. She had to choose between excluding Amber and allowing her father to be at her wedding. Fortunately, he spent most of his time bending other guests' ears about Scientology. An ongoing choice we had to make was between helping the Scientologists by going on the record about Keith and helping Keith by staying silent. We had to make this choice every time the investigators knocked on our doors, literally. From the outside, it looks very simple. Father molests children, father goes to jail, family never sees him again, and any deviation from this is inexplicable. From the inside, it's complicated and torturous and horrifying. We were children and we loved each other, and our parents did not. No one should ever have to make these choices, but we didn't have the option. The sources. Gail Grant, formerly Henson, Carolyn Meinel, and I, Valerie Henson, are willing to speak on the record and give whatever other help we can to uncover Keith's history of child molestation. We still won't work directly with the Scientologists for the simple reason that no one will believe what they say. It's kind of getting confusing to me, but I hope you guys are following. Gail Grant, formerly Gail Hansen, was Keith's first victim that we know of. She is willing to talk to reporters, give dates, places, and names, and help dig up records. Her story below of Keith's molestation of her and 3 other children is deeply upsetting. Don't read it unless you absolutely have to. Gail Grant's description of Keith Henson's child molestation definitely not work safe. Gail can be contacted at gailgrant@earthlink.net. Okay, this gets really long. Hold on. I'm going to go ahead and read more of it. Carol Meinel heard Gail's story and Keith's confession and knows all the details of the aborted police case, and her divorce from Keith. In 2007, emailed to me, Carolyn offered to help dig up evidence against Keith Henson from the email. If you should decide to encourage Gail or redact it to finally take action to put Keith in prison for what he did to them, I can help by hunting up contact information of the 2 counselors who heard Keith's confession, Dr. Don Eckerstorm and Cindy Noche. Presumably some public records also remain. Note that prosecuting Keith is impossible because the statute of limitations has run out. The last time a Scientologist hired investigator showed up at my house, he didn't care about Keith's 1974 to 1981 child molestation. He only wanted to know if we had any suspicion that Keith had molested children more recently. You see how dark and disgusting these people are? Do you guys see it? I, Valerie Henson, was only a few months shy of my 4th birthday when Carolyn divorced Keith. I do have memories of living with Keith and of neglect and abuse on both his and Carolyn's part. But I do not remember him molesting me. Various doctors over the years have noted physical evidence suggestive of molestation, but nothing conclusive. Can't give first-hand testimony about Keith's child molestation. I can only assemble my sister's testimony and the documentation related to the case. I, too, am willing to talk to reporters, give dates, places, and names, and help dig up records. I can be contacted at val.henson@gmail.com. If you convince me that you are neither a stalker or a Scientologist, I will talk to you over the phone. Painfully but not surprisingly, our half-sister Amber Henson has decided that she cannot and will not believe that her father molested her half-sisters. She still gives interviews defending and supporting Keith, to our sorrow and frustration. This willful blindness is unfortunately common with allegations of incest. It's hard to believe that someone you love and trust as much as your father could commit such terrible crimes. It's often much easier to believe that your sisters or cousins or aunts are lying. A note on false memory syndrome. That's not real, you guys. A reasonable person might question whether Keith Henson's accusers are suffering from false memory syndrome. You know, the Satanists made that one up, just so you guys know. Remembering things that did not happen in order to satisfy some other need. Certainly, sometimes people remember things that did not happen. The cases of repressed or recovered memories, which turned out to be debunked by third-party evidence, often have similar elements: strong pressure from a therapist or authority figure on a young child to tell them the story they want to hear, or in adults, a long, slow process of elucidation, beginning with a fragment of a memory, followed by recovering more and more details over a period of months or years. Note that cases of actual abuse have also been found this way, but false memories can only be created via a long process of confabulation and manufacture of detail. Who is this long? Oh, she had another, I'm not going to read the whole thing. She had another stepfather, John Bosma, try to molest her. So apparently her mom is really attracted to pedophiles. So anyways, it's kind of a weird, this is interesting, but sad, of course. But interesting how the molester was like an anti-Scientologist. And then Scientology, of course, didn't care about the children. Just, was he more active abusing children in the more recent years? So I will put a link in the description. Peace, everyone, and good night. Good day, wherever you are.